Here's what I want to accomplish tonight. Three things. First, I want to emphasize that I believe that today conflict is primarily a competition of narrative. Second, that our opponent, as we will discuss with respect to ISIS, has a strategy that involves dividing and compelling. And third, how we fight this war will be as important as whether or not we win this war. Okay, before I begin, I have a mandatory statement that I am speaking to you today as a private citizen and not as a representative of any official policy or position of the United States government. If you happen to be recording this, I hope you recorded that. Okay. Throughout most of human history, the primary determinant of conflict was the competition of violence. In the post-World War II era, conflict changed to where the primary determinant is the competition of narrative. Narrative has been a component of conflict throughout time, but beginning with the use of nuclear weapons, several critical elements changed. First was the management of violence potential, primarily as we limited total war because of nuclear weapons. The next was the role and the rise of popular opinion and will in making decisions. And finally, the rise of communication technology. This means that a narrative today can be generated, transmitted, and maintained from numerous actors with historically small resources. Therefore, relatively small acts of violence can have dramatic influence. All of this leads to an increase in the relative value of narrative vis-a-vis violence as a primary driver and the determinant of victory in conflict. One of the challenges in the current conduct of conflict is that the United States tends to wage war with a preference toward kinetic targeting, with the narrative as a supporting function at best. Our current opponent, the Islamic State or ISIS, views war as primarily one of narrative, where their violence is designed to promote their narrative. Narrative, as I use it, includes core identity, foundational liminal narratives that define how we sort and filter information, and transient narratives with which we are inundated throughout our day. The transient narrative information is filtered and either accepted into the liminal narrative or rejected and discarded. If accepted, it can reshape the liminal narrative for future transient narrative experiences. This is important because each culture has a liminal narrative unique to that location and group that determines how our words, deeds, and images are perceived. It is not enough to know what we want to say, but we also need to understand how those words we say, the deeds we do, and the images we show will influence our potential partners and current adversaries. The past and current leaders of the Islamic State, or ISIS, are sharing their narrative that they are the army of the righteous, leading the faithful to the end times. They seek to separate out all those who believe or disbelieve. The faithful are welcomed to their group, and the unfaithful are fought and destroyed. They recognize that the potential faithful are not awake to their threat. Al-Qaeda believed that the faithful needed to be awakened by bringing the U.S. into the Middle East. ISIS leaders did not think that awakening was sufficient. The faithful needed to be compelled. To compel them to fight, ISIS generated a civil war in Iraq where Shia attacked Sunni, and the Sunni had to band together to fight for themselves. Compulsion is essential to the growth of ISIS and the existence of the Islamic State. This is why so much effort is placed on sectarian violence. Their violence serves a purpose of promoting their strategic aims for uniting the Sunni faithful to fight and forcing them to turn to ISIS as their only legitimate protector. Their violence is couched within their narrative. It is not a violence-driven organization, but rather a narrative-driven one. Yes, they kill by what we consider to be barbaric means. The point of their barbarity is to drive home their primary message. This chart shows narrative space with terrain and separate from both physical battle space and cyberspace. Narrative space does have terrain, words, images, ideas that have greater value than others. It isn't truly separate, though. Narrative space, cyberspace, and the physical battle space are all interrelated. It is shown this way to communicate that it is a domain that requires a separate and different way of thinking. In this case, I drew it wrong to communicate it right. ISIS has a narrative. How do they use that narrative to maneuver in the narrative space? The decisive operation for ISIS is determined by the ideology, as this is also the decisive terrain as defined in the liminal narrative of humiliation, disrespect, and dishonor heaped on Arabs and Muslims for generations. It is the holiness and infallibility of the faith and its founding leaders and the prophet. It is linking all of this to a reminder of a world of possibilities promised by those holy leaders. They will take Rome. They will control the world, and they will be the ones to usher in the final days. They are remaining and expanding. The very use of these words is critical to communicating permanence and power. It is through ISIS that Muslims will regain their honor, their respect, and their pride. It is through ISIS that God will bless the world. They are or will be everywhere. This narrative is their decisive operation. The primary shaping operation is influence building through engagement. ISIS does this in a variety of ways, 3 in general. First is through traditional face-to-face meetings. Here they use their grasp of the culture to develop relationships over time to facilitate future opportunities. Second is through media. This includes the use of social media, YouTube and similar video upload sites, internet posts, blogs, and chat rooms, and email communication. This is the broadest of the 3, as the behavior can be broadcast or narrowcast. This involves franchisees, freelancers, and crowdsourcing, as well as actual members of the organization. Third is through actions. This is not the actual fighting kind of actions, though that may be a part of it. Some examples of their actions illuminate the meaning here. Destructions of artifacts in the Museum of Mosul and the archaeological site at Palmyra are done to communicate both remaining and expanding, as well as eschewing idolatry and idols. The treatment of non-believers as chattel communicates remaining and governance, as well as the dominance of ISIS and their brand of Islam. The existence and actions of morality police reinforces the rule of law and the idea of stability throughout the caliphate. The secondary supporting operation is the actual violent fight. These are done to add weight to the narrative and to the engagement. They are winning. They are sowing fear in the hearts of their opponents, and they are dominating the apostates and the crusaders. These have weight and are necessary elements because they reinforce the narrative and they provide resources useful in developing influence. ISIS maneuvers in the narrative space. How does the West, and specifically the U.S., fare in this space? I've conducted an unscientific and anecdotal poll on and off for at least the last 6 years, where I ask people what is the positive U.S. narrative in this fight. The answer is usually that Al-Qaeda or ISIS is bad and we need to defeat them. That answer is not positive. It is a negative response. So when I point this out to the polling participants and I ask again for the positive narrative, the response is typically one of silence. In fighting such a group, one of the key elements comes from the Greek myth of the Hydra, or of Hercules' second labor of fighting the Lernaean Hydra. To defeat this enemy, Hercules needed to cauterize or heal the wounds of the heads he defeated before they regenerated additional heads. Healing the destruction and damage is as important as defeating these modern hydras, as is the damage and destruction itself. ISIS wants to communicate that it is everywhere. It is remaining and expanding. If it can be seen as an everywhere organization, then it is okay for them to lose somewhere. They can lose Ramadi if they are everywhere. They can lose Mosul if they are everywhere. They could probably even lose all of Iraq if they are seen as being everywhere. So long as they are expanding elsewhere, then they can lose somewhere. Much of their mystique is in the perception that they are everywhere and that no one is safe. It is in this competition of narrative we need to engage with our ideas or narratives. Ideas and narratives that will inspire peoples and nations to do the difficult things we are asking them to do. We are typically seen from the perspective of the Middle East as being about materialism and rampant sexualism. The images in the upper left are the top 10 television programs of 2012. These represent in some ways a philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry. Thus, the narrative that we broadcast to the world is that in America you can eat better, drink better, and be merry better than anywhere else. In contrast, ISIS presents a message that they are the army of God, and that by joining them, you are serving God and bringing about His divine plan. The average young person wants to have a purpose. They want to have meaning. ISIS provides a contrasting alternative: fight for God or live in materialistic hedonism. So I want to emphasize that I've tried to give ISIS's perspective in this, rather than the perspective in general. So just as our media communicates a narrative of America that is not reflective of the majority of Americans, so does our characterization of most Muslims. We tend to look at Muslims, as was already stated tonight, as if they all want to destroy the U.S. as reflected in this image. And I want you to note the numbers, because this is probably the best guess number of all, not just ISIS, but all like-minded groups within Islam, and what percentages they are of Muslims. Instead, this image is reflective of the vast majority of Muslims around the world. There are more than 1.5 million Muslims, and more than 99% of them do not agree with the interpretation of ISIS concerning their faith. And I hope you notice that it's not just 99%, but it's like 99.97. Why does this matter? Most of you are not actually going to go out and fight ISIS, so why should you care? So we must fight ISIS and others within a context of understanding. Much as the ancient hero of Greek mythology, Hercules, had to heal the wounds of the Hydra as he was in the process of removing the heads before more could grow back, so too do we need to understand that continued focus primarily on violence without healing degrades and destroys the very infrastructure needed for civilization to exist. We are thus creating an environment wherein our opponents can thrive and we cannot. This is not a conflict of civilizations, but this is a conflict between civilizations and a robber culture. We need and want civilization around the globe. They do not. They will use the tools of civilization, but if all the Twitter and Facebook and social media in the world were to end tomorrow, if all the roads, bridges, refineries, museums, and libraries were destroyed, civilization would end, but the robbers would continue. Ignorance will continue to create a desert and call it victory. We have severely damaged or destroyed civilization in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and Syria in this war. The robbers are growing there. We need another way. We need to emphasize the importance of understanding and empathy, understanding that we are fighting enemies that challenge previously held conceptions, understanding that the opponent is motivated by an ideology and encouraged to great effort through powerful and deep-flowing narratives, understanding the opponent in their complex context and the competition of narrative, empathy to develop influence with our partner, and empathy to identify our opponent's center of gravity and effectively engage and destroy it. There is no question in my mind that ISIS is an enemy of civilization and the United States of America. They are also a group that does not have the wherewithal to pose an existential threat to the United States. That said, it is not in our interest to allow them to develop such a wherewithal. The information presented here is done so with the intent of communicating what one needs to begin a journey toward empathy, which I believe is also the necessary path for the journey toward victory. I will refer you to my website. You can currently download 2 papers that I've written on this topic, as well as a relatively comprehensive bibliography of articles and recommended articles highlighted.
Thank you, Brian.